On April the 15th, 1912, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a British liner, the RMS Titanic, was sinking. In the early hours of the previous night, she had struck an iceberg. She was running out of time, and on the deck, half of over 2,000 passengers and crew were fighting for their lives. In the scramble for survival, 8 men played on while the ship was descending down the water. These men were the musicians who were going down to their deaths. They didn't attempt to save themselves, and instead they played on until the end. These are the stories of the musicians of the Titanic. In April 1912, musical sheets began to appear in shops worldwide under the headlines like Be British, and just as the ship went down, these sheets included songs of love, loss, and speculation. One had been called a descriptive march, in which it marketed itself to families to recreate the traumatic events that had occurred. The sinking of the RMS Titanic became the tragic result of an unexpected collision where over 1,500 passengers and crew passed away. 8 of them were the musicians, who, to a few people, bravely sacrificed their lives by playing until the end. But what is mysterious is that for a time, no one went into the depths of the musicians' whereabouts. Some historical documentaries leave them out of the picture. Some of the Titanic movies and television shows gives the musicians little screen time, only to shine a light on them when they begin to play the infamous final song. In some way, the musicians have been put aside in favour of stories like J. Bruce Ismay, Captain Smith, and Thomas Andrews. Now, we are diving into the musicians' final moments. Before we clarify the events, it should be noted that while we may not know most of the story, we can guess what happened during the sinking based on the testimonies from the survivors on that terrible night. Minute by minute, piece by piece, we will recreate what could have happened to the musicians during the Titanic's final moments. At 11:40 p.m. on the 14th of April 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. She was only 3 days away from reaching her destination when nature collided with a human-made vessel. With the iceberg that struck on her starboard side, the damage resulted in the Titanic opening 6 out of her 16 watertight compartments. This sealed Titanic's fate, but Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews didn't know she was sinking until 12:10 a.m. Around the same time, on E-deck, Roger Brecox, Georges Crins and Jock Hume were getting ready for bed in their cabin when they would have felt an increased vibration. Upon feeling it, they ran to the port side to meet with the rest of the men. In the quintet's cabin, the trio could have told them what had happened. There was little doubt, as they knew something was wrong. It's not known how long it took them to walk from their cabin to the quintet's, but it's possible that they would have met the quintet at 11:54 p.m. at the latest. At around 11:55 p.m, all the members had a visit from Captain Edward J. Smith, who informed them that the ship struck an iceberg and the crew were getting ready to lower the lifeboats. Now, according to some accounts, it is believed that the captain had instructed them to go up on deck and play to keep the passengers calm. But since they were considered as passengers instead of crew members on board, chances are that the captain didn't order them to play. It's most likely that they decided to play by their own choice, or if Wallace Hartley suggested this, and he might have been the one who instructed everybody to go up on deck. At 12:15 a.m. on April the 15th, all 8 men, still dressed in their evening wear, gathered their musical instruments and hurried towards the upper deck. Crew members who saw them laughed at the musicians for running to save their instruments. By this time, the musicians probably wouldn't have known that the ship was sinking, and the crew members who made fun of them had no idea what was going on. On their way towards the upper deck, stewardess Violet Jessup bumped into the men, and recounting the events, she saw Hume's pale face, but in a cheerful voice, he said, just going to give them a tune to cheer things up a bit. They went into the reception room on D-deck, and, with their instruments, the men went on top of the grand staircase, or the Louis XIV staircase, and began to play while the passengers were waiting for the lifeboats. Whilst playing, it was noted that there was little noise inside the reception room and the passengers were calm. In the aftermath of the disaster, some survivors said that the music the musicians played helped them all, and a wise provision tending to allay excitement. But their music wasn't just heard in the reception room, as survivors said that they could hear them below decks and were heard as far as the wireless room. It's also thought that 30 people stood around the musicians, but some would have been crew members, as they tried to keep the passengers calm before letting them out of the first class entrance and onto the boat deck. Outside A deck, some crewmen were awaiting orders. They were seen smoking and tapping their feet in time for the music. By 12:25 a.m, no orders were made to launch the lifeboats. On the bridge, the captain, Ismay, the crew and Thomas Andrews knew what would happen to the Titanic. However, other people wouldn't find out until later in the sinking. At the same time, the musicians would have stopped playing and would have headed back down to E-deck to retrieve their overcoats. For John Woodward, it was to retrieve his cello. He didn't take it up with him to the reception room, playing the piano instead, but it's unlikely the reason why the musicians stopped playing. We don't know why they stopped playing. However, what we might know is how they could have responded to the ship listing down. The flooding of E-deck started at the same time when the musicians went to their cabins for one final time. At a 4.6 starboard list and a 2.7 head trim, the Titanic was taking water in the forward bow section. Although their cabins were in the stern and middle part of the Titanic, the musicians might have heard about the situation from an unnamed crew member who might have passed them. After 12:35 a.m, some of the musicians left E-deck and walked out of the second class entrance. It's unclear who was first, but John Woodward was the last person to walk out. After 1 a.m, the water reached Scotland Road, and by 1:30 a.m, water had climbed into the E-deck landing. However, there was one musician who was still below deck. Roger Brico was still down below, and he might likely have seen the water beginning to creep up Scotland Road. One can imagine his reaction to the situation and retrieving what he needed, whether he was stopped beforehand when he struggled to find his overcoat or something else. Bricox hurried away from his cabin. He was reunited with the rest of the men, and all together they went up on the boat deck. By 1 a.m, the group were heading towards the starboard side and stood outside the first-class entrance. When they were all together, Bricox caught up with second-class passenger Brenda Lehmann. In her account, Lehmann said that she saw him talking to another lady. When they had finished their conversation, Lehmann went up to Bricox. I asked him what was wrong. He just told me that we would have to go on another boat to get to New York, and that I should go down and get my coat. I went, and when I came back up, he put a lifebelt on me and took me to another deck. He said to a couple of officers that there was another lady. From this account, it is believed that Bricox guided Lehmann to the port side, where he assisted her into lifeboat number 12, which left at 1:30 a.m. At 1:40 a.m, the musicians reunited once more, and it was from there they began to play music again, and continued playing ragtime and more saloon music for the next 20 minutes outside the first-class entrance. There was a sharp, cold wind on the starboard side of the Titanic, and by this time the mood on board began to change. Revolvers were fired, people were screaming, and passengers were scrambling to the port and stern side of the ship. This made it impossible to lower the last remaining lifeboats. However, the musicians must have known that soon they would be in the ocean, and there was no hope left for potential rescue. At 2 a.m, the musicians decided to play hymns. While playing hymns, the musicians had their lifebelts brought to them by First Officer William Murdoch. He told the musicians to put their lifebelts on immediately. In response, Hartley, Clark and Hume stopped briefly to put their lifebelts on. The rest of the musicians, however, continued to play on. Towards the end, the musicians had begun to change their tune, and after taking a break from playing hymns, it was known that they played Son d'Automne, or Autumn as it was known. At 2:14 a.m, the musicians began to play their final tune, which is the infamous hymn, Nearer My God to Thee. Remembering the conversation he had with Ellwand Moody on the Mauretania 1 week earlier, Hartley knew that Nearer My God to Thee would have been the one he wanted to play. During Nearer My God to Thee, E and C decks submerged. The strains of the music became fainter, as though the instruments were filling up with water. On top of all of this, their playing had been drowned by the screams of those who tried to scramble up the poop deck or who had jumped into the water. When the musicians played their final notes of the hymn, the ship then broke in two. As the Titanic broke in half, the musicians dropped their instruments, except for Hartley. Hartley, at the time, must have strapped his case around his body either before or when he was in the water. The rest of the instruments went down with the ship or were violently thrown into the sea by the gravel force of the breakup or the violent thud of the funnels. We cannot say what happened to the first 5 men, whether they had been crushed by the funnels, if they jumped into the water, or if they fell down the decks when the Titanic broke in half. But, from what we know, it is thought that Hartley, Hume and Clark jumped into the water along with over 1,500 people. Hartley may have been seen by passengers playing on the stern side. He might have fallen into the water when the stern began to go underneath the waves. The Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. with people screaming in the water. For an hour, the cries grew fainter until there were no more screams left. In the calm and flat water, there was an ocean of wreckage above the surface. Amongst the wreckage, there was a keyboard from a piano, possibly from the one in the reception room. In the water, trimmer Thomas Patrick Dillon was sucked down by the Titanic, but when he reached the surface, he continued swimming for 20 minutes. Moments before, he had fallen into the water with Hartley. He didn't say if he swam with Hartley, but it's unlikely. However, he said that all around him, he witnessed people succumbing to death by ice burn. Those who survived on board lifeboats were hesitant about returning to the scene. However, some wanted to go back to rescue as many passengers as possible. In the end, only 2 lifeboats returned, lifeboat numbers 4 and 14. As well as retrieving Dillon and Hartley, lifeboat number 4 pulled 8 more men from the water. Sadly, 3 people died, one of them being Hartley. It's not known if he died in the lifeboat as Dillon lost consciousness, but like the other 2 bodies, Hartley's body may have been placed back into the water. Between 4 a.m. and 8:30 a.m, survivors were picked up by the RMS Carpathia, and the Cunard steamer turned around and headed on to New York City, where it arrived on the 18th of April. Nearly 2 weeks later, Hartley, Clark and Hume's bodies were recovered by the Mackay Bennett. Next time, we will be looking into the aftermath of the disaster, from a court case to a family legacy that continues into the 21st century.